Welcome to the most important sermon. I'm your host, Chester Stanley.
And I'm your co-host, Robin Stanley, and wife of Chester. And we'd like to welcome to the program Pastor Dave Edgren. Welcome, Dave. Good to have you here.
It's good to be here.
Fabulous.
Excellent. David, we just want to discover a little bit about you as a person, your background, your call to ministry, etc., etc. But I think we'll start with your background. That accent sounds not to be an Aussie accent. Tell us about where you come from.
It's a bit mixed up, yeah. I grew up in California. Grew up in Northern California, and moved to Australia in '94 as a volunteer for a year.
Okay.
But ended up meeting my wife. She wasn't my wife yet, but she is now.
Yes.
And at the end of that year, we were married. So I've pretty much lived in Australia since. So I've been here for about 15 years now.
Okay,
Fabulous.
right. So what made you decide to come and spend a volunteer year in Australia, a long way from California?
Yeah, I came over to Australia in 1998 with Dale Galusha, who's now works at Signs in America, and I work at Signs in Australia, so it's a bit funny that ended up that way. But he was my youth pastor, and he was the speaker for Brisbane Camp, and I was 15 years old in 98, and 88, and when he brought me over, I came home after a month here and said, man, I want to go back to Australia, Mom. And she said, there's only certain ways you can get over there. You can't just move over because you're not Australian. So I got to university, or to college at Pacific Union College, and started looking at volunteer positions. And I spent half a year in the Marshall Islands and loved that. And so I came back and said, if I want to go to Australia as a missionary. And they said, it's a first world country. There's no missionaries in Australia. And then a couple months later, they called me and said, you're not going to believe it. 3 student missionary calls came in for Australia. Do you want to go? So I went, and I went to Lilydale Academy, which is in Melbourne, and I spent a year in Melbourne, and my wife was from the next suburb over, and we met early on that year and fell madly in love. So.
Well, we'll come to that a little later on. That sounds to be an interesting story. What was it that attracted you to come to Australia? What was it, the people? Was it the countryside, or was it...
I think it was because when I came over with my youth pastor and I saw what he did, and the ministry that he did as we went to Brisbane Camp. We landed in Melbourne and we drove all the way to Brisbane, which is quite a long way. It's 2 days driving if you just did it, but we took 2 weeks to do it. And I saw so much of Australia so fast that I wanted to come back. And that was always in the back of my mind, is I want to go back to Australia and see it slower. So this is my slow seeing of Australia. I'm still here.
How many years, Dave, has that meant for you since you came to Australia?
I've been here since '94, so I've been, 2008 now, so it's 14 years.
Oh, very good. And in terms of your background in California, brought up in a Christian home, an Adventist home? Or?
I was. My parents became Seventh-day Adventists at different times. My mom was raised in an atheistic home, but her grandmother was an Adventist. So every year she would go to camp meeting with her grandma. And so she knew, when I am out of home, I will be a Seventh-day Adventist. My dad took a little while longer. He said to her, you can be whatever you want to be. But after he saw the life changes it made in her life and the happiness, he started coming along. And so by the time I was 3 years old, we were Adventists. So in my mind, I've always been an Adventist, but first generation Adventist. And a growing experience, because I got to watch my parents kind of discover what it means to be an Adventist as well as we were growing together.
Excellent. So you attended high school, and what happened then?
I went to Rio Lindo High School for part of it, which is one of the Adventist boarding schools over there, and that really being there gave me the desire to go as a student missionary, because in year 12, I went for a week and a half to Central America on a fly and build, and it was such an eye-opening experience that there were people that lived so differently than me, and that made me want to see the world, but in a missionary capacity, not just a tour. I didn't want to go just see the world. I wanted to be a part of doing something for the world. So after high school, I went to Pacific Union College, and over the 4 years of being there, I spent 2 years as a volunteer missionary to various places, the Marshall Islands and Australia. And then at the end of that time, I met my wife, Jenny, and we moved over to America after we were married, and then came back to go to Avondale. So I finished my coursework at Avondale. I was a public relations major before I did the year at Lilydale.
Yes.
But after doing that year, I said, I really want to work with young people. And so that's when I changed to theology, and I did all of my theology at Avondale here in Australia.
Right.
Dave, tell us a little bit about the passion that drove you to be a student missionary. What was it that set you in that direction?
I think probably that what set me in that direction was seeing the other student missionaries come back.
Right,
Because they would come back and they would have these amazing stories about what they had seen happen and the life changes that they had gone through. And I had known them before they went and when they came back. And some of them were very different people. And so, and one guy came back and then left again. He said, I've got to go back another year. I didn't finish. And just that passion that I saw in other volunteer missionaries, student missionaries, I said, I want to do that, just to have that experience for myself. So I recommend it to every young person that I can, even if it's just to be a volunteer in their local church. Just do some volunteer work so you find yourself and your position, kind of your place in God's work.
And it's interesting that reaching out to other people actually helps you to find yourself, isn't it?
It's so true. Yeah.
That's great. In terms of your spiritual journey, David, anything dramatic happened there, or you brought up in an Adventist home and the desire to head to ministry comes pretty young, or was it a dramatic call?
You know, I never felt, even to this day, I've never had that kind of feeling of I've been called to the ministry. But from early on, I always knew that God had plans for my life. I remember once going and getting on my bicycle, and I was going to go ride, and my mom knew I was going to ride on the road because there was this really cool track that went across a main road, and she said, you're not allowed to go there. If you get hit by a car, you could get killed. And I said, I can't die. And she said, what do you mean you can't die? And I said, well, you told me God has great plans for my life. I haven't done anything for him yet. And I was about 8 years old when I said that. And so from early on, I always believed, and it's probably because my mother instilled that in me, that God has great plans for your life. And so I was kind of waiting for God to do something. And now it's interesting, as I go here and go there and do different things, I think, maybe this is the one thing. I might need to be more careful now because God has used me. But yeah, from an early age, I knew that I wanted to, no matter what I did, I wanted to focus it in on revealing Christ to those around me. But I had intended to go into public relations and marketing and that kind of thing and work for, whether working for the church or just being involved as a layperson in church. But I just knew that I always wanted to focus in on doing whatever I did for the glory of Christ.
That's fantastic.
I think that's the significant thing, your willingness, even though there was no defined point, somewhere between mum teaching you and you growing up, there was a willingness to actually work within God's plan, wasn't there?
Well, I've always been excited to try new things, and that sometimes can be a bit of a character flaw, that it's hard to stick to things, because I'll do something for a while and then think, okay, I've done that, let's go do something else. But it has given me a wealth of kind of experiences in different areas so that I can say, well, this is who I am and this is who I'm not.
Well, thanks, David. Really appreciate it. It's a great story, and we want to hear the rest of it. Stay right with us, and we'll be back.
Welcome back. We're talking to Pastor David Edgren. And David, you've been sharing with us your background. You've moved from America to Australia, and we've been discussing the fact that you've become a volunteer at Lilydale Academy. And Dave, I realise that wasn't just a volunteer position without any side effects. Tell us the implications of that.
Oh, it was life-changing. During that year, I met my wife. I had planned to come to Australia for a year and go back to America. But I met my wife during that year, and we dated, and we were married by the end of the year, and took her back to the States for 6 months, and she said, I want to go home. And so we came back to Australia. So really, I've become Australian because of that year at Lilydale. The other thing that it changed is my entire direction with my work life, because I was into my third year of a public relations course, and I was planning on working in communications. And then after spending a year in a dormitory full of guys and then working during the daytime on campus campus with the day students as well. Lilydale's a mixed campus of boarders and day students.
Yes.
And back then there was a larger boarding group, and so they had a boys dean and a boys assistant dean. So I was the assistant dean at night, but campus ministries director during the day. So I got to mix with these kids and hear their stories and see their passion for wanting to accomplish in life, wanting to go somewhere, but a lot of them not having any kind of idea of how to get started or what the options are. And I got really excited. I would read books and talk to the kids, and they would say, oh, I'm really interested in music. And so I'd go and research it and come back and tell them, well, here's your options. And I realized, this is kind of like being a guidance counselor, but I like the spiritual conversations the most. And so I went back to PUC and I told the guidance counselor there, this is all the stuff I enjoyed. I didn't like being a dean in the dorm, so I don't, but I did love working with the kids on the campus during the day, and I explained what I've explained to you, and she said, you need to go into ministry.
Yes.
And there was no course then for youth ministry or chaplaincy. You just did theology. So I went to Avondale, switched my coursework to theology, and because of the amount of work I'd done at PUC, it ended up being 3 years at Avondale of theology. So graduated 3 years later, and my wife studied teaching there as well until she surprisingly got pregnant.
Really? There you go.
Very good.
Okay.
So the volunteer thing obviously was really helpful in sort of focusing.
It really
absolutely.
was.
Okay.
I'd love to come back to this. You see this glow on David's face when he talks about Jenny.
Yes.
You sort of casually mentioned that you met here. Come on, you need to elaborate a bit on that story.
That's a fun story to tell. She was a year 12 student. Well, I was one of the employees at the school. So before I ever even, I had gotten to know her, sat next to her in choir, went to the library and talked to her. But before I asked her out to any kind of place, I went to the vice principal and said, here's the story. Is this evil or is it okay?
So you're right up front.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to do something wrong, and least of all, I didn't want to get sent home. And so I went and I talked to him, and he said, look, you're not actually employed by the school, you're a volunteer. You're basically, as far as the government and the school is concerned, you're a visiting student. So he said, so it's really up to you. He said you can decide what you think it looks like to other people, but legally, school, as far as leaders at the school, we're not concerned. So we started dating, and we dated. That would have been
while she was at school.
Yeah, she was in year 12, and we started dating in the middle of August, and the Australian school system finishes in December. So we dated right through there, and then I kept working until the end of June, and or the end of May, and we were married on June 12. And 1995. So that's how it happened. That's how Jenny and I got together. And I'm not a shy person, but it took me 2 weeks to say anything to Jenny. She was in the first row of choir, and I was in the back row. And I nudged the kid next to me, who was a dorm boy, and I said, who's that girl down there in the front row? And he said, oh, she's pretty, isn't she? I said, yeah. He said, her name's Jenny. And I said, oh, Jenny. So I just practiced, hi, Jenny. Hi, Jenny. Hi, Jenny. And finally one day I climbed over the seats and went and just plopped down next to her and said, hi, Jenny. My name's Dave. And she said, I know. Because I was the American volunteer, so everybody. And it was so stressful for me, but for her, she's like, and your next line, which I hadn't planned. And so that's how it all began. But then it was many conversations in the library, and hushed conversations, of course, and the librarian coming over and saying to Jenny, could you tell your friend to be quiet?
Oh, that's a great story. That's really. Where does Jenny come from?
Jenny lives just up the road from the academy. She lives in a town called Mount Evelyn, which she was 5-minute drive from school, and she went to that school her whole life. She went to Croydon Primary and then to Lilydale Academy, where she graduated.
So it must have been a surprise for her parents when she was a student at the academy to actually have a young American moving onto the scene.
Very much.
Were they happy about that?
Well, she was an only child, well, still is. But she was
stolen away to America.
Yeah, that's what they were afraid of, is that I was going to take her back to the States and they would never see her again. And that's even what it looked like when we got married, because we went to PUC and we were going to do 4 years at PUC. But then when we got over there, and that's when I talked to the guidance counselor and said, I want to change. And And then she said to me, well, if in the long run you want to live in Australia and minister in Australia, you should really do your theology in Australia, because they're going to pick you up where they know you.
Yes.
And so we came back. And so my wife was very happy to come back.
And her parents would have been exceedingly happy.
Parents were thrilled, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
David, in terms of these cross-cultural marriages, I mean, they tell us that sometimes there can be challenges.
Oh, the woman wins.
The woman wins.
It's just like a normal marriage.
So no major challenges, the American-Australian thing?
Not really, no. My wife's actually, her parents are German. And so she's was born here in Australia, but they came over from Germany before she was conceived. Like, they lived here for 9 years and then had her. And so she's very much Australian, but has German background, has family over there. So I have family over there, she has family over there, and it's just, we're a global family, I suppose you'd say.
Absolutely.
And just tell us, do you have children as well?
Yes, I have 3. Jenny and I have Cyrus is the oldest, he's 10 now, and then Rachel is the youngest, and she's 7, and Mikey, or Michael, is in the middle, and he is 8.
Okay, so all biblical names.
Yes. Yeah. I wanted to name, because Cyrus was the first one, and I wanted to name the next one Darius. But my wife wouldn't go for that, because
she's a wise lady.
But I said, but Darius was Cyrus's offsider, and she said, I'm not having 2 kings in the family. And she has King David in me, and then King Cyrus, and I got away with it. I got Michael, and she didn't catch that Michael's a king. So anyway.
Okay, well, that's a really great story. We love to hear about how you people met and how you found your wife, etc. We're with Pastor David Edgren, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. We're with Pastor David Edgren, and we've just heard a wonderful story about his romance with Jenny, his wife. And David, now we want to investigate and pursue some questions in relation to your ministry. Yep. So you leave Avondale College and you wait for a call. Where were you called to?
Victoria. I actually did a sneaky thing. They have what's called the President's Tea, where all the presidents come and they meet all the prospective graduates. I avoided all the presidents except for the one from Victoria, because that's where my wife came from, and I wanted to go to Victoria. So I didn't talk to any of the other presidents. And then, and then just before graduation, about a month before graduation, I wrote a letter of introduction for myself, which is something from my marketing background. And I thought, you write up what you want.
Absolutely.
And so I wrote up, explained who I was and what my passion for ministry was, and we came down to visit Jenny's parents. I went into the Victorian Conference President's office and gave him my letter of introduction and said, I know you already know me, but I'm David Edgren, and I just wanted to give this to you so that you had me in mind when you're looking for people for your conference.
Smart man.
And it worked, you know. But I did say to him that I wanted to be involved in a school as a chaplain, because that's where my passion was. And they actually positioned me in Geelong, which is a suburb/country kind of town, but they gave me 2 country churches as well. And the country churches, they gave to the pastor there, Glenn Townend, when they gave him me. And so he gave me the keys. He said, they gave me these 2 churches when they gave me you, so I think these are your keys. And so I had 2 country churches with no children in them, no one younger than probably 50. And then I had the Geelong church that had an active youth and children's scene, and a little church plant and a school. So because it was such a varied position, usually they move you after a year so you get a new experience. They left me there for the 2 years. And working with Glenn Townend was fantastic, because he's a fantastic mentor. And I got to see, I suppose you could say, how ministry is done right. And so I got to work with Glenn, watch a church plant happen, do a little bit in a school, and I found out through the country churches, I actually like old people. And as a young minister, you know, back then, that was something that I thought, you know, how am I going to relate to these people? But I actually really did enjoy it, and I realized that God knew what he was doing all along. So that's how I came into ministry, and 2 years in Geelong, and then
after that, David, what happened after that?
We moved into the city in Melbourne, and we spent 3 years pastoring a city church and associate pastoring another city church. Always right through until I started working at Signs. I had a school as well, so I was doing chaplaincy work as well. And then after those 3 years, we got a call to Tasmania, which is a beautiful little spot, and we moved down. Oh, it's fantastic. We moved down to Hobart, where I pastored a city church, if you can call it about that in Hobart, and a country church in Collinsville. And we spent 2 years there, and then got asked to come and work at Signs Publishing Company.
So currently you're working at Signs Publishing Company.
Yes.
What's your official title there?
I'm the associate editor of the publishing company.
And tell me, how does all this positive energy that you emit, David, fit into that role? Are you comfortable with that and enjoying it? Yeah.
You know, when I first got asked to consider that role, I was really, I said to God, what an opportunity, but is this me? Am I a desk person? I like people, I like interaction, and I just couldn't imagine sitting at a desk for 40 hours a week. But it has given me wings in my children's ministry, which is where my heart is. And I'm able to go and speak at schools, and my weekends are free. And what minister could say their weekends are free?
Wow.
So I'm able to go and really focus in on where God has, I didn't realize this until I started working at Signs, God has wanted me to develop my ministry in children's ministries, and so I'm able to do that now.
Wow.
So I sit at a desk, and we only work from Monday to Thursday at Signs. We work really long hours, 10 hours a day for those, for those 4 days. But then that gives me a 3-day weekend every weekend to go to schools and churches and camps and that kind of thing. And it's been a fantastic experience. And I've actually found, the old marketing skills of how to put an article together and that kind of thing have been great. I've been enjoying working at Signs as far as the actual work goes as well. So it's really been, it's amazing how God shapes you your whole life, and you think, you get to a point and you think, whoa, this fits in, this fits in, this fits in this. It's like God knew what he was doing.
Absolutely.
Fabulous. And so tell us a bit about this children's ministry. What direction is it taking, and what form is it taking?
Well, originally I thought, as I said earlier in the interview, that I was youth, that high school's chaplaincy. And every time that I've been asked to consider, would you be ready to go into youth ministry now? I've always felt this weight put on me, like, no, you're not, slow down. And I've always said no. And now when I look at it, I realize that my passion, when I tell children's stories, especially juniors, 10 to 12-year-olds, something happens to me. I just feel absolutely passionate about seeing those little people connect in a real way with who Jesus is. It's not just stories anymore, they're not building that foundation like primary is, where they're getting to know the wealth of information that are the stories that we know as, the Bible and Christianity. But now they're starting to make decisions with those, and they're saying, I'm ready. And I think it's 80% or thereabout of decisions for Christ are made between the ages of 10 and 12. So that's just it's a huge time in these little people's lives, and so my passion is really focused in on that area and that age group, and I live for kids, and my kids are entering that age group now too, so they get to start being, they come around with me. I try to take one of them on each trip that I go on, and so they've heard all my stories. They'll ask me, what sermon are you going to do today, and I'll tell them, oh, that one, yes, we've heard that one 5 times.
Okay, well, it's very interesting to have that sort of passion for children's ministries, and I've certainly seen David in full flight, dressed as, who was it, Elijah, as John the Revelator?
John the Revelator at the big meetings. Yes.
That was really good. Just briefly, in terms of your spare time that you have as a pastor, have you got any hobbies? What do you do?
I love computer games.
Okay.
I grew up as computers grew up. And I just absolutely, when I was a kid, if I had time off, I'd go and sit down on my computer, my Atari 2600, and play games. And now I still, I don't get to play that much, but if I get 2 or 3 hours a month, I go, oh, a good month. But when I was a kid, I couldn't, once I started a game, like at the Christmas holidays, you get it for Christmas, and then you have to finish the game. And so I love gaming. I also really like writing. And so writing, yeah. I like to write down my sermons, to write down, and I didn't do that before I was working at Signs. I would just put them in note form, and now I'm starting to say, well, let's put these down in article form or book form and circulate it, get it out there to people. So I've been doing a fair bit of that as well.
Excellent. That's a great story, and you obviously enjoy Adventist ministry. You seem an exuberant, happy Adventist pastor, and that's wonderful. Well, you're here and you're going to preach to us.
Yes.
The series title is The Most Important Sermon. What's the sermon you've got for us, and why?
My sermon title is God's Storytellers.
Okay.
And the reason I've called it that is because it's an introduction to why I'm so passionate about storytelling. It looks at the biblical background for what it means to be part of God's story. And it connects through to another series of programs we're doing here on the Hope Channel called God's Storytellers, where a good friend of mine, Brian Boyland, and I are actually going to spend 13 shows telling stories to kids and modeling it.
Excellent. We look forward to your preaching, David. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chester. Hi, my name's David Edgren. One night as I was putting my children to bed, I asked them, what kind of story would you like tonight? I have 3 children. My youngest is Rachel, and my next oldest is Michael, and then there's Cyrus. Well, Cyrus was about 7 years old, and he said, or Mikey burst out, a Bible story. And Cyrus said, no, not a Bible story. The Bible's boring. And this actually shocked me because he'd never said this before. And being a bit flustered, I just responded, well, Cyrus, what kind of story would you like then? And he said, oh, I don't know, something cool like about dragons and swords and something like that. And I said, oh, okay. And my mind started to race, and I'm thinking, what kind of stories could I tell? And then suddenly I had this idea. I said, hey, Cyrus, what about if there was a Bible story about dragons and swords? And he said, oh, well, that would be really cool, but that would never happen because dragons aren't real, and the Bible only tells the truth. And I said, well, there is actually a story in the Bible about a dragon, and it even has a sword in it. And he said, really, Dad? And I have to be honest with you, I have been known to tell fibs to my children. And so I had to convince them, yes, it's true, there really is. There's what's called a prophecy. And you know, when Jesus was here, and I explained it to them, when Jesus was here and he told lots of stories that meant other things called parables, well, before he came and after he left, he told those stories through his prophets, and he called them prophecy. But most of them are stories, and they're just like parables. And this is one of those prophecies. My kids weren't too sure still, and they said, well, tell us the story then. And so I said, okay, let me get my thoughts together. And I had to think about it because I'd never told this story before as a story. I'd used it in Revelation seminars, but never told it as a story. And so I thought to myself, and I said, okay, look, it starts with a woman, and the woman is really pregnant, and she's standing on the moon. Dad, I said, no, it's true. It says it in the Bible. She's on the moon. Remember, it's a prophecy. So she's standing on the moon, and she's starting to have her baby. And so she's pushing, and she's doing the breathing, and she's going, oh, and the Bible says she cried out in pain as she was giving birth. Well, as she cried out, the dragon heard her. And the dragon flew out from underneath the earth, and he flew towards the moon. And he started flying towards the moon, and he was getting closer and closer, and the woman was screaming, and the dragon was flying, and the woman was screaming, and the dragon was flying. And then the dragon landed with a thud on the moon, when he skidded to a halt, and then he started clawing his way towards the woman. And she was just about to give birth, and the baby came out, and the woman reached down to catch the baby, and the dragon's head, no, 7 heads, swung in, 7 huge red heads on 7 long red necks with huge red leathery wings. This dragon was massive, and this red dragon was skidding to a halt, his head's coming in to get the baby because the dragon wanted to kill the baby. And the woman wanted to save the baby. It was her baby, and so she reached down, and the dragon was coming in, and just as the two were about to connect, a hand came out of heaven and caught the baby and took it up into the sky. Well, this made the dragon very angry, and so the dragon began to run again, and he clawed his way towards the edge of the moon, and he jumped into the air, and he started flying as fast as he could after that hand. And he flew as fast as he could, and he tried everything to catch up with the hand, but he couldn't catch it. And somehow, between the time of leaving the moon and getting to heaven, the little baby in the hand had grown up. And when the dragon finally landed on the shores of heaven and skidded to a halt, the baby was a grown man, and his name was Michael, and he stood with a sword, and he was the dragon slayer. Well, the dragon's angels landed alongside him, and Michael's angels gathered with Michael, and there was war in heaven. And so the dragon and Michael began to battle. And the dragon would swoop in with his heads and Michael would parry. The dragon's angels would attack Michael's angels. And there was back and forth. And every single step took the dragon and his angels one step closer to the edge of heaven until they started falling off. And soon it was just the dragon and Michael, and they were having a great battle in heaven. And the dragon lifted up his 7 heads, and Michael saw his opportunity, and he charged in with his sword and pushed it against the breastplate of the dragon, and the dragon clawed at heaven, but couldn't hold on, and he tumbled out of heaven and spun backwards, down, 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 until boom, he landed on the earth. When the dust cleared, and he stood up and put his wings back into joint, the dragon was angry. He couldn't get the baby. He couldn't get heaven. What would he do? And so he looked around and he was amazed. Right there in front of him in the desert was the woman, just standing out there in the desert. And so the dragon started to run towards the woman. He knew what he was going to do. He was going to get that woman. And so he ran as fast as he could towards the woman. And the woman saw the dragon coming. And she started to run, and the dragon was running. And the woman was running, and the dragon ran faster. And then the dragon leapt into the air and began to fly to catch the woman. And so the woman jumped in the air and sprouted wings like an eagle and started to fly. And Dad, I said, it's in the Bible. And so the woman was flying, and the dragon was flying, and the dragon took in a huge breath. No, 7 huge breaths. And he shot out, and the kids all said, fire? No, water. He spewed out this huge tidal wave of water, and it was so big that the woman couldn't see over the top of it as she was running, and it was so wide that she couldn't see around it. And so she just ran, and she thought, no, I'm going to drown. The water's going to get me. And the water got closer and closer and closer, and she couldn't see the dragon anymore because of this huge pile of water. And then the ground opened up, just tore open, and swallowed the water, and it was gone. Well, the dragon, now that the water was gone and the dust had cleared, he looked, and he couldn't see the woman. Because the woman, just as the hand had taken the baby away, the hand had taken the woman and hid her somewhere. And the dragon was really angry now. And he said to himself, I can't get the baby. I can't get heaven. I can't even get that woman. I will get the rest of her children. Okay, kids, that's the end of the story. It's time for bed. Dad, you can't stop there. I said, well, that's the end of the prophecy. That's where it finishes. It's bedtime now. But Dad, and little Rachel, 4 years old, what about the children? And I said, what do you mean? He said, the children, Dad, the children, the dragon, the children. What about the children? And then suddenly it hit me why prophecy is given as story. These kids were rapt. They were right in the middle of it, and they couldn't let go of the story. And they said, what about the children? And so I said, well, you know what? Let me actually, and I thought this is what we do in prophecy seminars, let me unpack it for you. Let me ask you, all of the things mean something in a prophecy. Everything is symbolic of something else. Who do you think the dragon represents? And that was easy for the kids. They're like, the devil, Satan? And I said, very good. I said, what about the baby? Who do you think the baby represented that grew up into Michael? They said, Jesus? I said, very good. And what about the woman that was standing on the moon that had the baby? And little Rachel said, Mary, mummy of Jesus? And I said, well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because Mary was Jesus's mom, and the lady that had the baby on the moon was the mom of Jesus. And Mary was in the desert. They ran away from Herod, didn't they, who was controlled by Satan. They ran into the desert. They went to Egypt. But you know, it's even bigger than Mary. It's so big, in fact, that it's not just about one person that Jesus came from, but it's about a whole group of people called the church. And Jesus came from the church, and he also came for the church. And so that's what the woman represents, is this group of people that are the church. And I said, so with that in mind, that this woman is the church, who do you think the other children are? And the kids thought about it for a little bit. And then Rachel said, us? And I said, yeah. And I said, you know, what do you think the devil's doing to try to hurt us? She said, making people sick. And one of the boys quipped in with making people mean to each other, making wars, making bad things happen. And you know, they started listing all the things that people list when they say, why do bad things happen to good people? And I was able to tell my children that, you know, The devil doesn't want to hurt us. He doesn't care about us. He wants to hurt God. And he couldn't get Jesus. He couldn't get the church. He couldn't get heaven. So he's going to try to get us because he knows it will hurt God. Well, after that children's story, putting my kids to bed, I went out and I flopped onto the couch and I thought to myself, what just happened? I'm a passionate storyteller and I tell stories to children all the time, and I had just never thought of using prophecy as stories. I looked through the Bible for another story, a good story. Why had I never seen prophecy as narrative? Why had I never seen it as material for stories to children? When yet nearly all of them are stories, all the prophecies. And as I was sitting on the couch talking it through with my wife, I started getting more and more excited. And I started realizing, I have to be honest with you, I did not know the story of the dragon and the woman. Revelation 12 is what that is. I did not know that story as well as I just told it to you, because I'd never thought of it as a narrative before, and I'd never looked at the progression of how things went. I'd always just used it, this proves this, and this proves this, and this is that, and, you know, pairing it up with truths and with realities, but never saying, let's just tell the story. And so when I did tell the story, I wanted to know if I told it right. So I sat on the couch and I got out my Bible and I started reading through Revelation 12. And something really struck me. There's more to this story. Yes, it is an awesome narrative, a powerful narrative, but there's these key texts in Revelation 12 that show us something about these children, about these end-time people, this church that will be at the end times. Here's what it says at the end. There's only 18 verses in Revelation 12. It's just a short chapter. But it finishes in 12:18, but 12:17, just before the finish, says this: Then the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And so what this verse tells us is the identity of God's end-time people. There's two things that identify them. One is they obey God's commandments. They're passionate about God's law. They know the 10, they keep the 10, they honor God by honoring His commandments. But then it says they obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Well, if you look up the word testimony, church folk have a meaning for testimony that basically is telling your Jesus story. What Jesus did in your life when you met Him, or something recent that's happened to you that God has done in your life. But for the vast majority of the people in the world, the word testimony is a courtroom word. It's a word that means, I saw it from this perspective, this is what I saw. And my testimony is going to be different than your testimony because I was on the other side of the street. So I saw it from a different angle. And so this verse is saying that God's end-time people, they're identified by two things. They obey God's commandments and they're testifying or telling their testimony of Jesus, their story of Jesus. Now, if we back up and go to verse 11 of Revelation 12, it says this. It tells us how these people became God's people in the first place. How were they saved? If I was to ask you, how are we saved? You would probably say, by grace, through the death of Jesus on the cross. And you would be right. But have a look at this fascinating verse. Revelation 12:11. They overcame him, that is the devil, by the blood of the Lamb, that's the blood of Christ, and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Did you notice the word and? They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. Well, that's Jesus on the cross. But then it says and. Grace and? Certainly not. But look what it says. Blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. What this is actually saying is that if you have been saved by Jesus, if the blood of the Lamb has been something that has washed you, that you've given your heart to Christ, you cannot be quiet. You can't help but tell it. It's not saying, okay, you know Jesus died for you, now you have to go tell it. It's you cannot help yourself. These people, they're identified by keeping God's commandments and by telling the Jesus story, but they're saved originally because of what Jesus did, and the way you'll know that they were saved is because they're talking about it. Now, what's interesting in these two different testimonies in Revelation 12:11 and 12:17, one says testimony of Jesus. The other says their testimony. And it's very different things. The testimony of Jesus is my story of what happened to Jesus. Their testimony, or my testimony, is my story of what happened to me. And so what happens is these people are saved because of the blood of Jesus and what it did to them. They can't help but tell it. but they're identified because they're keeping God's law and they're telling people the story of Jesus. They're saying, let me tell you who Jesus really is. Let me show you this epic story of evil versus good, of a baby born who would die for mankind. And we tell the Jesus story, not just it changed my life, but here's how it can change yours too. Now, when we think of the phrase, the testimony of Jesus, many, many phrases in prophecy have key phrases elsewhere that unlock the meaning. And one of the key phrases for this, or a particular key phrase, is Revelation 19:10. And if you look in the New Living, or the New International, the King James, the New King James, they all say the same thing. They say this: the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So we say, there you go. It says that these people in the end time, they have God's commandments and the testimony of Jesus. So we've taken that, many of us, to mean that that means that there will be a prophet among us. But what's really fascinating, and that's true, that there will be the presence of prophecy in God's end-time people. But when you look at the New Living Translation, something really fascinating comes out. They translate it like this: the essence of prophecy, this is Revelation 19:10, the essence of prophecy is to give a clear witness for Jesus. Now you could almost say, those aren't even the same verse, but they are at their heart. The first one says the testimony of Jesus is having the spirit of prophecy. But the second one is saying that the whole reason for prophecy, the essence of prophecy, is that it gives a clear witness for Jesus. Why does prophecy come out of the mouth of the prophets? To show people Jesus. And so when we realize that these end-time people are the testifiers, they're the people sharing this clear picture of Jesus, we see that the spirit of prophecy is very active in God's end times people, because yes, they're identified by keeping the law and telling Jesus' testimony, and they're saved by the blood of the Lamb and telling their testimony. We are that spirit of prophecy. God's end time people are telling that story. Now, is this a new idea? Is this something that God just gave to the end time people, or has it been here for a long time? It's interesting when you go back to that law, those 10 commandments. You can find them in two places in the Old Testament. There's Exodus 20 and there's Deuteronomy 5. Moses, when he records it in Deuteronomy 5, he finishes by saying that God actually spoke the commandments out loud. And the people heard it, and it was this booming voice, and it was petrifying, it was scary. And so the people came to Moses and they said, Moses, can you please ask God not to do that anymore? They said, not to do what? Not to speak to us. You don't want God to speak to you? Well, we do, but we want him to talk to you, and then you tell us. And so Moses went to God and he said, this is a strange request from the people, but your thundering voice scared them. And so they would like to know if you could speak to me, and then I will speak to them. And God said, okay. He said, yes, I'll do that on one condition. And you find that condition in the next chapter, Deuteronomy 6. And this is what God says: yes, I will speak through my prophets. I will speak through a mediator. I will let someone stand in between me and mankind on one condition. And here's the condition: love the Lord. He said, go tell the people this. Here's what they have to do: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols to your hands. Bind them to your foreheads. Let them be in your actions and in your thoughts. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. What God says is, okay, I will speak to you through the prophets on one condition: you don't let people just go and talk to the prophet to find out what God's all about. You tell them who Jesus is to you. You tell them who God is to you. Parents, tell your children as you rise and as you sit down, as you are going, wherever you're going, tell your children about me. Tell your children the stories of God's people. And from the very beginning of receiving the law, God gave them the commission to go and tell the story. And it's interesting as you look at so many people in Scripture that as they develop in their obedience to God's law, that they really take ownership of this idea of being God's ambassadors, being God's storytellers, his testifiers. And we see it beautifully in the life of John the Baptist. John the Baptist comes to the Jordan River and he yells out to the people. He says this: as it is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, a voice of one calling in the desert, Prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight paths for him. When people heard this idea, prepare the way for the Lord, they knew what that meant. Back then, when a king was coming, they didn't have nice roads everywhere like we do now, because nobody, hardly anybody anyway, had a chariot or had a wagon. They all either walked or had a horse if they were wealthy. And so when the king was coming, a herald would come and say, prepare you the way for the king. He's coming. They would move the rocks out of the way. They would smooth places out so that there would be a road from one village to the next. And so when John came and said, prepare you the way of the Lord, make straight paths for him, people knew that this meant someone great was coming. And so John had said, I have read it in Isaiah, I have put it into my mind, and now I'm speaking it to you. And John testified about Jesus and who he was. And then Jesus came. And Jesus spent 3.5 years leading his disciples. And as he left, he gave some parting words. And his words would hearken back to what John the Baptist had said, and the way that John the Baptist had owned his identity as the testifier for Jesus. And, you know, about 3 weeks after the dragon story, at bedtime with my kids, we'd been talking at tea this night about what are you going to be when you grow up. And as I was tucking the kids into bed that night, tucking Mikey in, and I said, let's pray together, Mikey. So we prayed, and then he opened his eyes after prayer, and he said, Dad, I know what I'm going to do when I grow up. And I said, you do, Mikey? I'm 5 years old, and he's got it all figured out. So I said, what are you going to do when you grow up, Mikey? And he said, I'm going to kill the devil. I said, you're going to what? He said, I'm going to kill that devil. And I said, how are you going to kill the devil? He said, well, I guess I'll have to get some metal and melt it and make a sword, and I'll poke him in the tummy. And I said, you know, my first thought was, as a pastor, I should tell him, Jesus did this for us. Jesus died on the cross. He conquered the devil, sin, Satan. It's all over. But I was too fascinated by the mind of this little person. I wanted to know why. And so I said, Mikey, you know, there's 6 billion people alive on the planet, and there's millions and billions more before that, and there's many that will be afterwards. What makes you think that you're the one person in all of eternity, the one human, who's going to kill the devil? And Mikey looked at me like I was missing something, like something I had just not understood, something quite important. And he said, Dad, I am Michael. And I did what you probably just did. I laughed. I said, that is amazing. Because you know what had happened? He had heard the dragon story, and for 3 weeks he had been saying to himself, Michael meets the dragon, Michael has the sword, Michael pokes the dragon falls out of heaven, Michael, dragon slayer. Michael, me, I'm Michael. He had his job description cut out for him, and he was making plans of how to do it. And that night as I went and sat on the couch, I thought to myself, isn't the power of story amazing? God knew what he was doing when he gave prophecy, because he said, I will help people to see themselves in my plan, and they will see themselves so well, it will be as if I'm saying their name. And Michael, just happened to have his name right there in the text, and so he literally saw himself in God's plan. And do you know, God does have each and every one of us in his plan. And Revelation gives a very clear picture of what that plan is, that we are God's storytellers. We are his testifiers. We tell our story of what he did in our lives. We tell the story of what Jesus did and who Jesus was. And so after Jesus had been here with his disciples for those 3.5 years, he gave them what we call the Great Commission. And as we read it, we see hints, reminders of the old Deuteronomy 6 thing, of where he said, speak to them as they go and as they come. Let's read it. Matthew 28, verses 18 to 20. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go. It's interesting, that word go is literally as you are going. And it really ties in beautifully with the Deuteronomy thing of impress them on your children, talk about them when you sit at home or when you walk along the road, when you lie down or when you get up, as you are going. And so Jesus says to his disciples, therefore, as you are going, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. Jesus actually says to his disciples and to us through them, by them writing this down, here's what my end time people will be about. My end time people will have at their very heart my story. And they will go and they will tell people this story as they are going. As they're going out a door, as they're coming back in a door, as they're sitting on a chair, they'll relate these things to Jesus. You know, kids are pretty cluey with this stuff. If you say to a kid, you know, Jesus said, I'm like a door. How could Jesus be like a door? A kid will say, because you can go through him into heaven? You say, oh, yeah, good. You say, how is Jesus like a chair? And they'll say, because you can rest in him, and because when you sit down in Jesus' lap, he holds you and you can trust him? Yeah, good. And you know, this is what Jesus asks his disciples to do and asked his Old Testament people to do all along. Talk about me. Tell my story. Reveal who I am through your story. Tell what God has done through history, what he's done through Jesus, what he's done through the disciples, what he's done through you. Tell your story to your children, because nothing in the world can have the power to connect people to Jesus as your story can. Because you know what? Your story cannot be wrong. You can say, this is what the Bible means, and people say, yeah, but so-and-so says it means something different. But if you say, this is what happened to me, and you tell your story, your testimony, they hear it from your lips, and they see it in your life, and they hear your experience, and they realize, this is real. This really means something to these people and to this person. You know, just as Jesus was about to go back to heaven, his final words are recorded in Acts 1, chapter 8. And he says this. He's talking to his disciples, and he's told them to go to the upper room, to pray, to wait for the Holy Spirit to come. And then he tells them what will happen. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And what Jesus was actually doing in this statement is he was drawing a map of their world. He was saying, in Jerusalem, which is where they were, in your hometown, in your suburb, or in your city, or your region, in your state, in your country, and to the whole world. Jesus was painting a picture. This is how the world will know. It will know because you have told the story at home to the little one next to you. You've told the story at the bus stop to the person sitting next to you. You've told the story of what Jesus did to you. The blood of the Lamb did to your life and changed you. I once was lost, but now am found. You'll be telling that to people. And you'll also be telling them who Jesus is, what happened when Jesus was here on earth, and how Jesus gave his life, his one and only Son God gave, so that we could live. You'll be telling this story, and you'll show that this is why God's law is so important. Not because we need a list of things to do to keep us busy in life, but because these things reveal the very character of God. And as we keep the law, and as we share Jesus' story, and as we share our story, the world will be drawn to him. Jesus said that we will draw all men to him as we tell our story. And so I would challenge you, tell your story. Tell your Jesus story. Tell the law to people in a way that doesn't sound like a to-do list, but sounds like a liberating list of love. I would invite you now to close your eyes and to have a prayer with me in conclusion. Dear Lord, we thank you for this special time that we've had together where we could consider your word. And we've seen ourselves in it, Lord. We've seen our names in your book. And we have seen our mission, our purpose. And our purpose is to tell others about you, to connect them through us to you. Fill us, Lord. Fill us with the desire to do so and the ability to touch others with our story so that they might meet you and one day walk on golden streets in your kingdom. In your name, amen.